Hey, welcome to the show. Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we're gonna have a great day. Alright, so let me show you what I found, or to be honest, what my wife found. So here we've got a very interesting video I would like to react to and provide further commentary. It's called Viking Age Expert Answers Viking Questions from Twitter, tech support. And this was posted on the channel Wired, which has 11.5 million subscribers. And as we can read, archaeologist Scott Jarman, a Viking Age specialist, joins Wired to answer the internet's burning questions about the Vikings. I am so ready for it. When did the Viking Age begin? Well, that's an easy one. How do we know about the Vikings? Where did they voyage to? How did they navigate so effectively? Did Vikings really sacrifice humans? Oh, that's going to be a nice one. Let's see what she says. Were the Vikings actually more violent than other cultures of their day? Not necessarily, probably more effective. Answers to these questions and many more today on Viking Support. I love the name Viking Support. Anyways, we're going to watch this, but just so you know, if you also want me to review the other episodes, that it's called Ancient Roman Expert Answers Roman Empire, where we see that there is a which Roman emperor was the best, or if you want me to review that one as well, let me know in the comments. You Muppets. Alright, let's go.
I'm Kat Jarman, an archaeologist specialising in the Viking Age. Let's answer your questions from the internet. This is Viking Support.
Hit me.
From @Lungfish2K. Who knew that Vikings had cool nicknames? I completely agree, they really did have some very cool
Absolutely.
names. Well, hopefully some were quite rude and offensive as well. So
Just like Reddit.
Vikings had normal given names. They didn't have surnames in the same way that we do. They might have what we call patronymics, so you could be the son of Thor or whoever. But after that...
Yeah, just the son of Thor, my dad. Oh no, nothing. He's just the god of the... Yeah.
They gave them some really good other names, depending often on some quality that you had or a skill, for example.
It's actually quite similar to how some surnames originated in the Roman period, and in general, there are quite a lot of modern surnames that originate like that, from a skill or something that describes you, or your ancestor in that case.
I have a little list here of some of my favourite names. We've got Eirik Ale Lover, Ketil Flatnose. We have
Ale lover, of course.
have Olaf the Witchbreaker, Eystein Foulfart, and then we have...
How is that one of your favourite, for crying out loud?
Kolbein Butterpenis. Some female names include Thurid Soundfiller, Halgard Twistbreak.
Sound filler for a woman. Oh yeah, Viking Age humour. Love it. Sound filler.
And Thorbjorg Shipbreast. I guess it depends a little bit what your main qualities were, how people wanted to remember you. From @DavidKruger01, how violent were the Vikings? Yes, they were very violent people, but they
Pretty much everyone.
weren't actually the only ones. Early medieval, this sort of whole period in Europe, was a very violent one. They were certainly very successful. We know...
It's interesting that they, whoever the editor is, pulled up a... let me go back to it. Image from the Bayeux Tapestry of the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Probably would have used something a little earlier than that, but still. It is true though, like pretty much everyone was violent and there were a lot of wars and fighting.
They were certainly very successful. We know that they had really good battle techniques, they had really good weapons. But we also have to remember that a lot of the sources we have about the Vikings were written by their enemies.
Okay, so we have 2 points here that she's bringing up an interesting way. That's a very good way to respond that out, where they're very violent and she's like, yeah, they were very successful, excellent weapons, good techniques. I think that's a very good way to approach it, because at the end of the day, yes, there are some cultures like even the ancient Romans where we can say, oh my gosh, they defeated this number of people and conquered this number of territories. Of course, by comparison, it makes it sound like they would have been more violent or perhaps even bloodthirsty than other cultures that didn't achieve that. But oftentimes that's not because, oh, the others were all like pacifists and the Romans, or in this case, the Vikings, the Norse, should we say, were horrible. It's just because they were the ones that actually did manage to do that because they were more effective. So this idea of seeing it as a matter of violence, then you would have to look at it at a comparative level, and the comparison should be between cultures of the period, not between what we do now and what they did then. Even though then again, I mean, if you look at Second World War, can we really call them violent? But now she's talking about the bias in the sources, and that's also another very interesting item of discussion. Let's see what she says.
sometimes there's a little bit of a bias in those sources. We
Sometimes it's massive.
do also know from a brand new study, actually, that back in Scandinavia, there's a difference between the different Vikings. The Norwegian skeletons had far more injuries than...
Okay, this is an interesting one about the osteological record. Absolutely, there is a lot to say about that when it comes to the Norse, but I also want to kind of finish and expand a little bit on the point where she mentioned the bias. In this case specifically, a lot of the information we get about what the Vikings did, generally speaking, is connected to Christianity, in the sense that either, if it's in period sources, it's a lot of stuff that's written by monks that absolutely hated the Vikings and of course considered them to be demons and menaces for obvious reasons. I mean, at the end of the day, think of Lindisfarne. It's not like the Vikings or the Norse were very nice to the monks in those monasteries, so as they were seeking for silver. So at the end of the day, it's absolutely understandable, but of course when they describe, or the Norse society, that they may be skipping areas just because they want to paint them in the worst light possible, that instead an unbiased source would have told us about. And then the second element is that a lot of the stuff that we read, including the sagas, were written after the Viking Age, and therefore when the Norse had already converted to Christianity, and so you can imagine that if there is a sort of educational theme behind the things that have been written, that it's possible that that would have introduced bias in the way the culture was described.
And the Danish ones. In fact, about a third of the skeleton studies all had violent trauma to their bones, but only about 6% of the Danes. They also had far more weapons.
I actually wonder, I would like to ask this specialist in this case, if the fact that the Danes had less wounds means that they were less prone to combat, as it seems like she's trying to underline, or that they were just better at it. You know, if you parry a strike, it's not gonna, with a shield, it's not gonna, yeah.
In their graves, which all points to a society that was extremely violent compared to others.
Compared to others in this case. But yeah, they were a violent society, absolutely. Let's see the next one. Very fun, this is great.
From @Finuas. So how accurate are the Vikings TV shows on Netflix?
Oh my gosh, she's gonna explode. She's gonna explode, mate. Anonym, it's good that you kept your anonymity, my friend. That's good. Battle axe.
They're not very accurate, but they are inspired by a lot of real events. A lot of them are inspired by the sagas. Mm-hmm. So, for example, in the latest ones where you have King Knut and Emma, there's a lot of the facts around these people that are really quite close to what we know happened.
Already the fact that she's utilizing the later ones as an example of accuracy tells you a lot. Objectively better first and second season, even though when it comes to accuracy, you know.
From historical records. But there are other things that aren't quite right, or that go a little bit too far. One of those is the portrayal of women and female warriors.
Hey, look at that. Nice. Interesting topic that she's presenting, and there is a lot to say. I'm sure she's going to talk about shield maidens and how, at the end of the day, we don't really have much of a historical way to validate the notion that shield maidens were a thing. I mean, maybe, very likely that it was more of a mythological thing, but then again, it's possible that some shield maidens, or should I say, female warriors existed, but it would have been a minority, and we can't prove it. I think that's what she's going to say. We'll see what she's going to say, but I have a lot to say on this. So, if anything, this might be the section where I talk the most. I thought she was going to talk about the weapons and armor, because, I mean, Viking series, at one point, you see the main protagonist wearing a helmet that wouldn't been a thing for another 800 years. 800 years of anachronism. It's a burgonet. And it looks horrible. So, but let's see what she's going to say.
Now, this is something that's called quite big debates, because certainly in the Vikings show, we have plenty of female warriors. In fact,
Lagertha is awesome, though.
Entire armies made entirely just of women.
Yeah, that's nonsense.
We do have records of what we call shield maidens, so they're these sort of fighting women, but they're usually...
Yeah, I also hate the way... Did you see how that fight was? I mean, she's carrying a massive round shield I have a replica of, might show you in a second. She's carrying that shield, and yet she fights... The shield is like held back, whereas the shield is your line of defense, so you would hold that forward. And she's holding it back as she's doing basically this, like a sort of little Olympic fencing with the sword, with a Viking sword though. And in that case, the shield is nothing. What is it? Just a counterbalance. So I kind of hate scenes that you have a shield. That happens in video games as well. Like you have a shield, but when you attack, the shield goes all the way back. You know, it is what it is.
Thought to be mythical.
Yeah.
We have female goddesses like Freya, for example, the goddess of warfare.
She's going to mention the Valkyries.
You have the Valkyries of Valhalla, for example, that swoop down onto the battlefield and take the fallen warriors up to Odin's hall. But do they really fight? This is the
Birka BJ581.
called Birka Warrior Woman, better known as BJ581. This is a grave that discovered quite a long time ago that we classified
1878?
as a warrior grave. It was an individual buried.
I actually disagree with classifying it as a warrior grave, because if you classify it as a warrior grave, Professor, what happens is that you are automatically telling the public this was a warrior. How do you know that? Simply because you've got, a funerary kit, weapons, axe heads and swords, that doesn't automatically mean that the person in that grave was in fact a warrior, in the sense of someone who not only knew how to use them dynamically, but actually went to war. It could also be a situation of a status representation, which of course I'm sure she will present, because she did say there is a lot of debate. This is the debate. Therefore, it shouldn't really be called a warrior grave if you don't know if that's an actual warrior or if it's just someone who's an elite. I'll tell you what, I'll expand on that after I give her a chance to first, present her points. So far, she's doing great. She's fantastic.
Buried in a very rich grave full of every type of weapon imaginable. Ancient DNA of this show that this individual was actually genetically female. I think the likelihood is that it was possible for women to also take part in battle, but we really didn't have that many of them, because we would have had more evidence. We would have more graves, female graves, with weapons and with weapon injuries.
Right, so that's not enough about this point, because she didn't mention a controversy that has to do with, well, not a controversy, but something that absolutely needs to be pointed out when it comes to Birka. So I suppose I'm going to do that. And also we do need to underline the fact more deeply about the correlation between the bones and the articles that are found, sort of grave goods that are found with the bones. So let me do that. First of all, just to give you a little bit of an excavation analysis, when we talk about the Birka burials, we're talking about several burials that were excavated, as we say, in the 1800s, and they are, generally speaking, considered to be a 10th century sort of burial. Now, what should have been mentioned in this case is the fact that we know for a fact that all of the bones, all of the contents of these burials have been moved, handled, and, if I may say so, mishandled several times. What this means is that we are absolutely unable to say which goods now belong to what set of bones. And this is not because I am saying it, this was specifically stated by the museum and its public information. Thus, even the notion that the Birka burial consists of a female individual or bones of a female individual which were buried together with weapons is speculative. Maybe, maybe not. In fact, due to the way that the bones and the material goods have been mixed, we will never know. Interestingly enough, there is at least one other burial found in Norway that is certainly a female burial with military grave goods, which was excavated in the 1900s, so it's a little more recent. Now, for the details, I'll have to revisit the documents. It's been a little while. Before I remember, this is a single burial of a woman who received trauma to the head, probably an axe blow, and was buried together with an axe head and a sword. However, does this one mean then that we are looking at an actual possible shield maiden or a Norse warrior? Well, in order to answer it correctly, there are a few other factors that we need to consider. Of course, there is a pointer. I mean, this woman did take an axe blow to the head, so at the end of the day, it's very possible, not necessarily automatic, but it's very possible that her death occurred during a dynamic fighting situation. Maybe, or she was executed, who knows. However, we can't know if she knew how to fight, if she was also a warrior. And that's something that unfortunately is an issue that always needs to be considered when looking at remains of female within warrior contexts. In that we are not absolutely certain that the tools found within the burial were in fact used dynamically by the buried individual. There is no way to know unless there is also a piece of literature that describes this. So, of course, your question could be, but if it's not an actual warrior, then why would they be buried with weapons? Well, the reason is that they could be pledges by her husband, her father, her son, not uncommon in the Norse culture and in a lot of cultures, including Celtic one. They could also be a status symbol of a noblewoman or a member of the elite or the upper echelons of society. In that instance, she would be buried with a sword, but not because she knew how to use it, but simply because it was a representation of her high status. A form of honoring the dead, if you will. One last point that I want to present before I let the specialist, the expert, speak again, is that the situation gets very complicated when it comes to female and Scandinavians in the context of war. That is because it seems that the majority of the female burials attributed with military-grade goods in the Scandinavian era, which are few by the way, appear to show through genetic studies that the buried women were always allogenic, meaning individuals who were not part of the Norse culture, but were women from the either Balto-Slavic world or the Eurasian steppes. And as I say, that further complicates the situation because indeed we do have proof, material goods, documented evidence that tells us about the fact that yes, in the Eurasian steppes, whether it be the Sarmatians or the Sassanid Empire or maybe the Asiazages, there are populations that indeed had the element of women warriors within their culture. So, all of this to say, we have no idea if they did have actually women warriors or not. My take is I agree with the professor. I think that in general, the idea of full women warriors armies with shield maidens is nonsense. Probably shield maidens were more of a sort of mythological concept, but I don't exclude it completely that perhaps in rare occasions there were absolutely women that were trained in combat and perhaps even joined raids actively and knew how to use their weapons. It's just that that wouldn't have been the norm. And with that being said, I would love a video game that allows me to play a alternative history where shield maidens were a thing. I'd love that. But please, continue.
Nick 727. Did Vikings really sacrifice humans? There are a couple of archaeological finds that suggest perhaps people did get sacrificed. One of them is a site I worked on myself. We have a very peculiar grave of 4 young children who are buried together right outside a huge communal grave that we associate with the Viking Great Army in the 9th century. Chemical signatures in their teeth have shown that they've come from different places and they actually ate very different diets, but they died at exactly the same time. And quite a few people have suggested perhaps this is one of those examples where people were sacrificed. We do have some...
Well, the simple fact that there are children coming from, well, I understand the fact that children is kind of strange, but it's also possible that the community was a bit more diverse maybe in that case when it comes to, and also it would have helped if she told us how far in terms of distance these children were from.
Records that suggest that the Vikings did actually practice this particularly rather horrific rite. So one record is from somebody called Adam of Bremen, who writes that he visited the temple of Odin, Thor and Frey in Gamla Uppsala in Sweden. And there, every 9 years, the people would sacrifice 9 of each of the male species, including humans. Whether that's...
Okay, so one thing to add is also the fact that normally when you think about the idea of ritual human sacrifices, you're thinking obviously something connected to religion. So you're doing it because you want to embrace the gods. And so the gods see you. You take a perfectly innocent individual and then you sacrifice them to the gods. But I think, correct me if I'm wrong, of course. Once again, she's the expert, so take my opinions with a grain of salt. But I think there are at least a couple of instances where I could strongly point out to the fact that, yes, a specific man was sacrificed to Odin, but he was a criminal and he was going to be executed anyways. So rather than just looking at it as, oh, the Vikings performed human sacrifices as part of their religion, I think should be more connected to the idea of a religious expression of what would be a judicial system. So yeah, you hung the man, but you do it for Odin, you were still going to hang him because of the crimes he had committed. That's, I think, one way to look at it that could give us a little more perspective when it comes to this.
It's true or not? We don't really know. Next question is from Shufflopagus. How do we know about the Vikings? We don't really have many direct written sources from the Vikings themselves.
Which is fascinating if you think about the fact that they could read and write, at least those that did know how to read and write the runes.
We do have historical records that are contemporary from other people. Typically, they're enemies, other people who encountered the Vikings. So that could be the Anglo-Saxons, for example. Now, they have to be taken sometimes with a pinch of salt. Often they only really involve things like rulers, the battles, the bigger movements. They don't tend to tell us very much about everyday events and normal people. The Vikings themselves...
Which is a shame. I think everyday events, the routine of a man of the Viking Age, is actually so fascinating to me. Of course, the battles are fascinating. Of course, the political intrigues and the king this and the jarl that. It's fantastic, and the whole religious aspect is also interesting. But the day-to-day aspects or elements of their lives, what they did, what they ate, what sort of routine did they have, what time did they wake up, what was their breakfast like, how did they spend their leisure time, how intensely did they work. I mean, all of this it's so fascinating. I wish they told us more about it.
Elves did have a writing system. They had runes, but they were only used for very short inscriptions. So there's not really that much to get from them. We do also have what we call sagas, kind of like historical fiction, really. They are stories that are written about the Vikings.
Yeah, as you can see, late 13th century, so they were already Christianized by then, and there is a massive gap in time between when the sagas were written and the era that they were discussing.
Vikings, mostly written down in Iceland in the 13 and 1400s, several hundred years after the Viking Age has finished.
I really want to visit Iceland one day. I'll have to take my wife there.
Typically also written through a very Christian perspective, when a lot of the Vikings were pagans. So we are getting a bit of a skewed idea about what the Vikings were about. We then also have what I'm particularly interested in, which is the people themselves. So we can look at the human remains, we can look at the evidence from the bodies and the graves. So that's where...
Could you imagine if someone, I mean, I agree with her, she's fantastic, but could you imagine if someone just clipped that and they connected it to something else, like, hey, good morning, let's look at the human remains. Let's just look at the human remains. It's a sport.
Things like bioarchaeology comes in. One really good example of this is the Viking Great Army winter camp of Repton in Derbyshire in England. And we know about this one from written records. Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us that this great army overwintered in Repton in the year 873. Now, archaeologists in the 80s actually found Viking graves at that specific site. And one of them had an artifact. It had a Viking sword and also a Thor's hammer around his neck. That's a pretty good sign that this was someone of Viking origin. Radiocarbon dating actually tied him to that group, to the 9th century, so that was perfect.
That's fascinating.
In my own research, I've been looking at this grave called Grave 511, this man who seems to have been a warrior, possibly even the leader of the Great Army. He had lots of evidence in his body about violent injuries, some of them probably carried out with an axe. And I was able to look at the isotopes from his teeth, showing he most likely grew up in southern Scandinavia, quite possibly in Denmark. Interestingly, he was
a Dane.
Buried next to a younger man, and they had the same isotope ratios in their teeth, showing they probably grew up in the same place. And when we carried out ancient DNA analysis of these two bodies,
maybe brothers,
we could actually show that they were related. But not just that, they were father and son.
Father and son, imagine that.
All those sources about the Viking Age come together to tell this story about presumably a Viking leader and his son, who both died round about the same time in Repton in England. Michelangelo-esque adds, what did Vikings do for fun? They
bathe.
Certainly had parties, they had feasts where they would quite enjoy drinking mead and beer and get quite drunk. We know they did lots of other things. We found ice skates and skis, archaeological evidence.
Can you see how humans are humans, right?
Evidence for skis dating to the Viking Age. Well, they also had practical purposes. Next question from someone with a bit of a Viking name here. That's at Ragnar Bellion. Where did the Vikings go?
The man himself. Where did they go? He's asking. Maybe he's in Valhalla right now and he's literally texting her. Where did they go? Why are they not here with me?
Vikings start out in Scandinavia, so Norway, Sweden and Denmark. And from there they go all sorts of directions. A lot of them go up to what is now Britain, across to Ireland. We have those that go past the English Channel to France and Spain.
That's a wonderful map she's got there. You can make an amazing board game for it, like a war game.
Some go across the North Atlantic over to Iceland and further beyond to Greenland and even North America. And then again, others across the Baltic. From there,
I have a video dedicated to the Vikings in North America, by the way.
They go down these river routes in Eastern Europe, in what is now Russia, Ukraine, further down to the Mediterranean. And then even further than that, we know that some made it all the way to the Caspian Sea and also overland to Baghdad. So we really have a huge range of travel, both north.
Seriously, when people say Vikings were raiders and navigators, I would say they were navigators and raiders. Like, I would give navigators because, of course, they were also traders. It kind of depends, but I would absolutely put navigators first when you describe them. I think it's more apt.
South, east, and west. We know about this from a number of reasons. We have runic inscriptions, especially in Sweden, that actually tell us that people went to these specific places. Elsewhere, the archaeology is hugely informative. So when we, for instance, at Lancer Meadows in North America, find a site that has a very typical pattern of settlements, of houses, of artifacts that we know that we can associate with the Scandinavians. We can show that these people moved along. It's also traded objects. So for instance, in my own research, I looked at a carnelian bead found in England. We got exactly the same beads in Scandinavia. We got them in Eastern Europe, but they come all the way from India. And that tells us that the Vikings traded really far. They moved along these river routes and tapped into other networks like the Silk Roads, for example, from at Fake Lizard Squad. When did the Viking Age begin?
I figure that's something you can Google, mate.
It's almost a bit of a trick question. Seems to have a very easy answer. 8th of June 793, with the attack on the Lindisfarne that kicked off the entire Viking Age. But now we've actually been able to push back the start of the Viking Age even further than that, to about 750 or so. And this has come with a new discovery, a Viking ship in Salma in Estonia, where lots of people died and were buried, clearly killed as part of some kind of raid or attack. But it dates back much further, and interestingly, also in the East and not in Western Europe, as previously thought. This question is from at Erdreed Gnimmel. What is the...
I think when it comes to the periodization, and maybe from an English perspective, the Viking Age would still begin. When does the Bronze Age begin? When does the Iron Age begin? Well, it depends. I mean, in Africa, in which part of Africa, in Europe, in Western Europe, it changes significantly. I think when someone asks, when did the Viking Age begin? Probably my answer would be, where are you from? Because, I mean, if they are English, I still think it's correct to say that it began for the English in that specific moment, because whatever the heck the Vikings were doing on the other side did not influence the English whatsoever. When does the Viking Age begin? Sort of depends on perspective, if you will.
Technical difference between Norse and Vikings. Aren't they from the same tribes? Norse really is the language spoken, and Vikings is the name that we've been given to these people who...
Well, but then again, you can say the Norse to mean the people.
Come out of Scandinavia in between the 8th and the 11th century. We don't really know what these people called themselves. We're pretty certain they didn't call themselves the Vikings. But
well, of course, yeah, because a Viking is just someone who goes on a Viking, but so an expedition and whatnot. But then again, I mean, I just thought, I think we know that the Danes called themselves Danes. We know, Dane law and whatnot.
The name comes up quite a lot. It actually has a couple of meanings, and one of them is a person, an individual, and the other is a verb. It means essentially to go on a journey, which could be a raid, or it could be something a little bit more peaceful than that. But this word Norse, which is quite often used about the same people, actually comes from the language that they spoke. So Old Norse, which is the root of all the Scandinavian languages, so Norwegian, Swedish.
I love everything Scandinavian, by the way. I love the languages.
Danish, and as does Icelandic, which is probably also the closest in sound to what Norse would have sounded like.
I think that's fascinating how the island, as one would imagine, is the one that was more conservative, linguistically speaking, and that preserved some of the old ancient sounds that have instead evolved in a different shape in the rest of the Nordic continent. And I think that's interesting because we have a similar situation when it comes to the development of Latin languages and Romance languages, should I say, in the sense that the one, even though Italian is one of the, I would say, the second closest language to Latin. With that being said, Sardinian, the Sardinian dialect, specifically those dialects that are spoken in the north of Sardinia, because there are multiple, did preserve some elements of Latin when it comes to pronunciation that is gone in Italian and in pretty much the majority of Romance languages. So Sardinian being the closest language to Latin and how it was spoken by the Romans, similar situation here, island. I don't think it's a coincidence.
But what happens if you settle somewhere else? So if somebody comes from Scandinavia and settles in, say, England, how long do they speak Norse? When do they swap over to English? We don't really know. The same sort of people that come out of Scandinavia and the countries that we call Norway, Sweden and Denmark, they come into play much later towards the end of the period. So we tend to just lump them all together really and call them all Vikings. Next up is at Greg Stradamus. Vikings didn't use a compass while navigating their ships. So how did they get to know where they were going? There's a possibility they used something called sunstones, which would help to show where the sun was and so where north was and so on. But a lot of the time, they're really just looking at their geography. They're looking at the sea, hugging the coastline quite often. So if you're going across from...
like on Civilization, when you still haven't developed the later technologies that have to do with... If you're a player, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I don't even need to explain.
Scandinavia and over to Britain. You're taking the sort of shortest route, so you're looking for sites of land, going literally along the coastlines and knowing what the oceans are doing as you're moving around. From at the Grimfrost, did Vikings smoke pot? We have found evidence of cannabis seeds, in fact, in Scandinavia. So there's a couple of places where we've found this. One of them is one of my favourite graves.
That's, by the way, from a historical Viking reenactor who wants to justify the fact that he enjoys smoking pot during his reenactment activities and probably was called out. I'm calling it
Oseberg ship grave, one of these most spectacular, huge, big Viking ships. It was actually the grave of two women. They had a lot of grave goods, and one of these women had a little pouch, and inside the pouch were found several little seeds of the cannabis plant. Because what we don't know is how these seeds were used. Presumably they were planted. They could have used them for smoking. They could have used the herbs medicinally.
Yeah, I was going to say for medical reasons. It kind of sounds more connected to what the Romans did.
Alternatively, they could have been used for hemp. We know that people make rope out of hemp. At Arsamota.
So sorry, mate, I'm not sure if you... I mean, you could try and justify your smoking, but then again, I mean, I've never smoked in my life anything, so not the greatest person to help you support that.
Asks, watching Vikings Valhalla and wondering how they were just having unprotected sex and not afraid of disease or pregnancy. Were there special Viking condoms? I think the answer to that is no. Just sort of hypothetically, if they did have any, they would be made of organic materials.
So they wouldn't... Yeah, there are some ancient ones, though, connected to other civilizations. So it's not like an absolutely no, we don't know.
That don't actually last in the archaeological record. So even if they were, we probably wouldn't know. Were they afraid of disease and pregnancy? Almost certainly yes. But we don't have any evidence of sexually transmitted diseases. There are some that leave a trace in a skeleton, like syphilis, for example, can actually be so severe that it makes huge alterations into the bones. In terms of
be careful.
Pregnancy, we don't know that they had any ways of dealing with that, but slightly less pleasant knowledge that we do have is the possibility that they carried out what we call infanticide. We do have one written record, which is quite interesting on this, from an Islamic traveller, a man called Al-Tatushi, who came from Spain. He visited a town called Hedeby, which is now right on the border between Denmark and Germany. And he said that there, unwanted babies for economic reasons were thrown in the sea.
That is horrible. I mean, just freaking give it for adoption. I mean, not that adoption worked like today, but don't freaking throw them in the... That's such an evil thing to do. I'd rather work days and nights.
Is that true or not? We don't quite know, but probably the answer to the question is that yes, they were afraid. No, probably didn't have condoms, and they may have had to deal with the unwanted babies rather than the pregnancy itself. Next up, we have at Viking Historic, who asks, did Vikings use soap? We have some records that they did use soap, possibly something made out of lye and animal fat. More broadly, we know that they were really concerned with hygiene, and especially things like their hair. Very careful with washing their hair and combing their hair. Now, we know that both from written...
See, I'm a Viking.
Sources and from things like this, combs made of bone or antler. There's one record from an Arabic traveller who encounters some of the people called the Rus, and Ibn Fadlan said that these were some of the filthiest people he'd ever come across. They did wash every day, but they did it in a way he really didn't approve of. This group of men were given a bowl of water. The bowl was passed to the first person and then even spit into the same bowl. But at the end of it, he wouldn't throw the water out. He would actually pass it to the next person who do the same thing, just following all the way down the line. But if we go to
Hey, if you're the first one to wash.
Anglo-Saxon England, we've got quite a different perspective. We have a quote from somebody called John of Wallingford, who complained actually about all those Scandinavians, all those
Too clean.
Vikings that settled in England. They caused so much trouble, not only because they would comb their hair every single day, they would also change their garments often, and they'll have a bath every Saturday.
Yes. The Saturday thing can still be found in the way you say Saturday in Scandinavian languages, which is like the day when you bathe. Phenomenal that it even resisted culturally and linguistically to this day. But imagine that. Oh, these Vikings, they wash too much. What kind of, are they even men? Why do women like them? Because then they were popular with women. I mean,
that way they actually attracted all the local women who were so much more...
Yeah, can you imagine that? Like, you're an Anglo-Saxon lad and you're like, oh, I hate these Viking men. They wash a lot and now our women like them. Well, there is a solution to that. Freaking wash. Wash yourself. Wash. So then the women will like you as well.
More impressed by these incoming clean Vikings than the local men they were used to. From @sarcasmcat24, what did the Vikings look like?
Man, these names.
Generally speaking, think of these people as quite tall, and normally, as in Scandinavia today, a lot of people who are blonde and have blue eyes. We have, however, recently...
Yeah, the gene is ancient. I think the first blue-eye individual was from Spain, if I remember correctly.
Discovered through ancient DNA studies. Now, quite a few of them actually had much darker hair. So lots of people with brown hair, even some people with brown eyes. We have one eyewitness description from a slightly unlikely place, which is the east. This is from Ibn Fadlan, who describes these people called the Rus, who he meets near the Volga. And he says, I have never seen men more physically perfect than they, being tall as date palms, blonde and ruddy. We don't actually have any pictures, we don't have any paintings, and apart from some of these other sources, we don't really have the descriptions either. It seems a bit like similar to Northern Europeans today, but not quite as stereotypical as we might imagine.
Interesting though, very, very interesting.
At Black Red Guard 1, what do modern Norwegians and Danes think of the Viking era? Are they proud of that heritage?
Maybe ask the Scandinavians that?
Cruel and barbaric time. I'm from Norway.
I was going to ask if she's okay. She's from Norway. Well, she sounds English, but I mean, I have found a lot of Scandinavians tend to speak very, very well. So that doesn't surprise me. Maybe she spent a long time in the UK?
Up in Norway, then moved to England and started studying the Vikings. I have to say, in Scandinavia, we are very proud of the Vikings.
Yeah.
Not necessarily the actual violent part.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. You should be.
But there's some quite horrific things took place, including...
And you can detach yourself. Same way. I'm Italian and proud of the Romans, but of course I'm not proud of Julius Caesar mutilating an entire village in Gaul and cutting their hands off. No, I'm not proud of that. But I am proud of all the achievements and the arts and the technological advancements and the basis of Western civilization. So of course, I think you can do that and there is nothing wrong with it.
Quite extensive enslavement of people, but we have the arts and the objects, the artifacts, all those trading networks.
I like her.
All of that is something that is seen with quite good pride, actually, in all those countries. I've seen in England, for example, you see it very much from the enemy's perspective. A lot of the written records really very much talk about how the Vikings were defeated. So you have people like Alfred the Great, who's hailed as this great hero who defeated them. In fact, I recently had to take the Life in the UK citizenship test, where one of the questions that comes up on the syllabus is, who defeated the Vikings?
Oh my gosh, so basically, this is hilarious. So a Viking expert who is Scandinavian on top of that, and she knows like freaking everything, now to get the UK citizenship is being asked by someone who most likely knows like 10% of what she knows. Oh, this is hilarious. I love it.
And the answer to that one is Alfred the Great, even though it's not actually true, because not very long after we have...
Oh my gosh, I so hope she did that. Oh, please tell me you expanded. Please tell me you wrote like a wall of text that the person is like, Alfred the Great, yeah, oh my gosh, who is she? I would love it. I would have loved it if she did that.
A Viking king, Knut, who actually successfully takes over all of England and rules it for nearly 18 years. So I can't really say that Alfred defeated them. Now we've got a question from @Dibble Gaming. What's with all the Vikings all over social media? Is it a trend, or did a bunch of people take a 23andMe and they're super proud of their 0.13%?
I have no idea. I wouldn't know how to answer that. What on earth?
The one key point here is no test of DNA can tell you that you are a Viking, because that wasn't really a clear identity. People didn't call themselves Viking. We had quite a lot of people moving in and out of Scandinavia. They interacted with lots of other different cultures, for example. So genetics, different from identities. That's the first point. The other is...
Very good.
...is that when you go that far back, the information you get from these tests, it's a little bit meaningless, because there are so many generations. You have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, and then it increases exponentially. So when you go back in time more than 1,000 years, you get a vast number of ancestors. But the population at that time was really quite small. So geneticists have worked out that you have these things called isopoints, so genetic points, where actually all the people who had...
This is a fantastic video, by the way, Wyatt. You did a great job.
...descendants and passed on their DNA are essentially related to all the people alive today. And that point in Northern Europe is in the 10th century. So essentially, if anybody in the Viking Age had children pass on their DNA and you got ancestry in Northern Europe, then you're going to be related to those Scandinavians. That makes it a little bit less meaningful. And the other point is that you're not actually comparing your sample to those ancient populations directly. You're comparing it to other people, quite recent populations who live in those countries today.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Telling you quite a lot about, say, the last 300 years or so. They're not really about the Viking Age itself.
I think she's great. She was fantastic. This was a great episode. Director, Anna, you did a great job. Photography, fantastic. Richard. Yeah, this was good. This was very good. And then, as we say, expert. So refreshing for once to have the word expert connected to someone who I absolutely would define as an expert. She was great. I really liked this episode. Thank you so much. And then Noble Ones, let me know if you want me to continue this and we can review a few others. But considering how well this one went, now I have, of course, high expectations. All right, Noble Ones, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you tomorrow for my next daily upload. Have a fantastic day. And remember, the Metatron has spread its wings. Goodbye. If you're enjoying this video, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much.